Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to The Grid. I'm Joel, aka The Blur Grammar, and this is a breakdown of Marvel Studios' Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Wakanda Forever is a story built around the grief of a nation that has lost its beloved king T'Challa with the loss of the late Chadwick Boseman, but more importantly, the grief of Shuri, and in that grief, that there still is power, which we watch as she processes all of the different dark corners of grief and sadness while also finding strength in the same experiences. More than just a movie about a villain and a hero, Wakanda Forever brings you closer to worlds you've never even seen before, and then others we've never seen like this. We need to dive really deep into this film to uncover the awesome Marvel Easter eggs and the crafty cinematic choices done by director Ryan Coogler. So let's take a closer look at the final phase for a movie scene by scene so that you can find out all the things that you may have missed along the way. Gotta drop the spoiler warning here. Let's get right into it. We open with a prayer to Boss from Shuri that is basically trying to save her brother, although we know the end story of how this is all going to go. But it's nice to see that the decision was made to try and bring him into the story without necessarily making him CGI or anything like that, like a flashback or something like that. Inside of or after this prayer, we break right into the opening scene with Shuri running into her lab, and basically there's a long shot that Marvel is known for at this point, and all of the things that are happening inside of this scene are basically telling us that this is a very high critical matter or medical emergency at this point, which has a look and feel that is similar to stuff like a Grey's Anatomy or something like that, where when something really catastrophic happens, we don't cut, we just focus on what's happening in that scene. Hey, is this video actually helping you? And if it is, you should probably hit the like button right now, because that means that you didn't see some of the things that I'm talking about right now, especially if you saw it twice. You definitely didn't see it. And that means we need to spread all this stuff across YouTube as fast as possible. So hit the like button right now. Okay, let's get back to the video. Inside of the long take scene with Shuri and all the other people inside of her lab, basically what she's trying to do is bring back or restore the heart-shaped herb, because in the previous Black Panther, when Killmonger was king, he took his initial heart-shaped herb and then had every one of them from then on burned. So Shuri is basically trying to recreate or synthetically create a heart-shaped herb in the way of the previous heart-shaped herb that the Black Panther is known for. In the background, we hear Griot, Shuri's AI, who is voiced by Trevor Noah, mention that the heart-shaped herb is only 28 to 29% effective, and if they go ahead and print it, it may not have a high success rate. Or basically, Shuri's asking inside of the lab, or asking her AI, what is the success rate of each build that she's doing here, and each time the success rate is under 29%. Angela Bassett then enters and tells Shuri that her brother is with the ancestors, because again, we know we then cut to the funeral scene, where for me that looks very similar to the alleyway or the street that T'Challa and Nakia were walking on inside of the courtyard, or inside the courtyard, I should say. And this feels almost like a processional through the places where T'Challa visited and frequented a lot inside of Wakanda. We also see the wearing of white, which is the same color that you would see in the ancestral plane, and also the way that Queen Ramonda and Shuri mourned King T'Chaka in the first Black Panther. We hear a name that we've only heard sparingly inside of this exchange, given to us by Shifo the Shaman, which is the predecessor of Shuri, Bashenga, which is the first Black Panther, the father, or basically the grandfather of T'Challa, who is the father of T'Chaka and all that kind of stuff. But as we go through this, we hear Black Panther said in English, similar to the way that Namor is said in English. So what that says to me is that this is a given name to, in this case, T'Challa and also Namor. Namor gets his name from the outside world, the same that Black Panther gets his name or their name from the outside world as well. And we get a final glimpse, or really the first glimpse, of what a casket looks like inside of Wakanda, which we never had the chance to see before in Black Panther 1 or any other preceding movie. So it's good, it's cool to see the way that Wakanda grieves and actually does their funeral processions and all that kind of stuff. In the processional, we see a mural of Chadwick Boseman and specifically T'Challa, which reads, "The Panther King forever lives in us and rests with the ancestors." This is what Queen Ramonda actually says as we go through this processional. Once we get to the end of it and everything kind of comes to a conclusion or a head, this is basically the culmination of what's happening with this processional. And it's possible that the mural could have ties to Shuri's hand tattoo, or more specifically, it could also have ties to Namor's bracelet, similar to the way that, or if you don't know what that tattoo actually says or is a symbolization of, it's basically a, for lack of better words, just to get through this just the gist of it is it's a symbol towards a higher power, basically similar to the way that Shuri and the rest of Wakandans actually are looking towards Bast at this point to give them strength to get through this terrible time and this tragedy that they are currently experiencing. Again, this connection could be twofold, both to the mural and also to the protection of the bracelet that Namor gives to Shuri later on in the film. In the celebration going towards the final resting place of T'Challa, possibly, and this is maybe a reach, but I do believe that because of the fact that Namor and the possibility of vibranium and all that kind of stuff being so old and so available in two different, or at least from the onset, it looks like there were two different places or two different meteorites that actually hit the earth. Is it possible that we get a foreshadowing of Namor in the way that everyone is adorned with their jewelry, the same way that Namor wears his when we first encounter him, when he comes out of the water to encounter Princess Shuri and Queen Ramonda at the same time? As we lead up to the gravesite for T'Challa, we see in the background of the dancers a statue of Bashenga and potentially a wife or sister. Can't really tell, but it could be that either one of those is the case, because in this movie, his sister and his wife at that point are very intertwined inside of this movie. In fact, they are basically the main two characters. And as the casket flies up into the Quinjet, music playing from the Ludwig Göransson's composition from the Ancestral Plane inside of the original Black Panther is exactly what T'Challa heard when he stepped into the Ancestral Plane for the first time after receiving the heart-shaped earth. After the gravesite, we get a flyover, which is basically a salute to, or a look inside of the way that Wakanda does its salutes to their king, or the passing of their king at this point. Culminate with this scene, which is probably the most impactful in terms of emotion, with Shuri doubling over T'Challa's casket. We transition into the fanfare, which is basically a moment of silence for Chadwick. The fanfare inside of the usual fanfare obviously has a lot more pomp and circumstance and a lot more going on with it, characters going in and out and all that kind of stuff. But this time we just get Chadwick and the many facets of him inside of the MCU and other places, I believe, but more specifically inside the MCU. This one hit hard, and if you weren't ready for it, it definitely made an emotional impact. Almost made me cry, but basically it is a tribute, or as much as we possibly can, a tribute and a moment of silence for Chadwick Boseman. But then we quickly move on into the rest of the film. We transition after the fanfare, and we get a courtroom scene where Queen Ramonda is basically brought to trial, or what seems like a trial in front of Congress, basically because the world at this point now believes that the world now knows about vibranium at this point and believes that it is a weapon of mass destruction, or can be used as a weapon of mass destruction, because, and this is something to note, vibranium cannot be detected by any type of metal detector at any point. As Queen Ramonda is talking, we then see an infiltration of a ship that gets infiltrated by what seems to be French military. And because of this, or inside of this, what they're looking for is vibranium. But what they don't understand is that vibranium has been on that ship the entire time, and behind the door that they're asking for them to open is the Dora Milaje. When they open the door, they are greeted with the Dora Milaje, and the entirety of that ship is basically Dora Milaje based. But they had no idea about that, or the French military had no idea about that, because vibranium is not detectable. So even if they had a hunch that vibranium was there, they wouldn't have known that the Dora Milaje had their spears and all that kind of stuff with them at all. Inside of this exchange, though, we hear Okoye and Aneka having a funny, candid conversation about the fact that she brought spears, or the fact that she brought daggers to a spear fight in this case. The reason why she brings that, or the reason why Okoye brings that up, is because she says that this, or these spears, have been given to us by ancestors at this point, and that they're both deadly and stylish. Fast forward to the first sighting in this case, in this scene, the first sighting of Namor and the Talokans in this stage. What we get in this particular moment is a callback to Namor's origin comic, which is basically when two people go down into the Atlantic Ocean looking for treasure or what have you, and encounter Namor for the very first time. This is exactly a direct comic accurate portion that is drawn from his comic, or the very first appearance of Namor in the comic. But the difference between the comics and the movie here is they're there because of vibranium, which is a difference, completely different than what they were there for before in the comics. But that then tells us that we have more places or more sightings potentially of the fact that vibranium doesn't necessarily just live in Wakanda. Talokan starts singing, which then makes everyone on the ship basically a zombie, or a inside of a trance-like state, and then just starts jumping off of the ship. Then are introduced for the very first time to Atuma and Namora. Atuma actually went against Namor a few times in the comics, basically because of the fact that, you know, Namor, or Atuma, stole his girl, and then Namor came back, and there's a whole thing about that in a different video. But basically, if you want the full rundown of who Namor is, feel free to head up to this video here. The general sense of who Atuma is basically a rival of Namor. Namora is the cousin of Namor, and basically in the comics she's practically the superhero version of, or the female version of Namor. We fast forward to the Quinjet and the arrival of Okoye, then get a callback reference to Black Panther, which basically is "We Are Home," which Okoye says in Black Panther. Inside of this scene, though, we hear the undisclosed illness, or the undisclosed, or from before. The movie does a very good job of keeping his illness pretty much out of the stories, to say that it's not about that in particular. It was to honor him in general. Something that we now get a chance to see different inside of Wakanda is the shield that now opens, so different than the way that it did before when in Black Panther 1, where we just go directly into a mountain. Then inside of Infinity War and Endgame, the shield actually, or more specifically inside of Infinity War, the shield is broken because of what Thanos did to actually get inside of Wakanda. So now they had to rebuild it, and what we see when we actually get into Wakanda for the very first time in this movie is a new shield opening, which he didn't have before. Something I find funny, and this is probably the only thing, or I might be the only person that found this funny, but Okoye initially doesn't like the suits for the Midnight Angels, which is, by the way, who they are. Those blue suits are the origin in the MCU, at least, for the Midnight Angels. And if you don't know who they are, the Midnight Angels are basically mercenaries mercenaries inside of the comics, which only or first appeared in 2 issues of Doom War. And if you've never read Doom War, the Midnight Angels are basically Dora Milaje on steroids. CNN's Anderson Cooper makes a cameo, which is a detailed breaking news of the botched attack on the Outreach Center that apparently Wakanda foiled, but we all know that was Namor. If you look at the ticker down below, you'll see that it says Scott Lang continues to tour in support of autobiography Look Out for the Little Guy, which is his book from Ant-Man and the Wasp. Okoye sees the eventual Midnight Angels attire and basically scoffs at it and doesn't say, or Shuri says that she doesn't like it, and she is saying this to Queen Ramonda. In the conversation of this, we also find out or get a glimpse that possibly there was a lack of motivation from Shuri in order to make the heart-shaped herb, specifically coming from their conversation in the bush, which is where you see a more comic accurate version of Queen Ramonda. And in that conversation, we kind of see and understand that Shuri doesn't really think that the ancestral plane is a real place, for one, and two, she doesn't believe that the heart-shaped herb, or she doesn't believe that the work that she was doing for the artificial heart-shaped herb was going to actually work. So there's probably the lack of motivation that was the reason why, or at least in this story, obviously we know the real reason why, but in this story, possibly the reason why is because she wasn't motivated enough to actually carry it out. We then fast forward to the scene that directly comes after the bush scene, which is basically Namor coming out of the water for the first time, showing himself, which is the most cinematic, comic accurate version that I've seen, that you could have had, at least I say that, of Namor, which is basically literally him just rising up out of the water, showing his dominance and acting like he doesn't care about anything on the surface world. In that whole scenario, we also see how Queen Ramonda is ready to fight and doesn't care about anything that Namor is actually saying, until she realizes that dude is very powerful, because the machine that was looking for vibranium before now is on shore, and how the heck did it get here? We see Namor, though. What I'm curious to know is that pure? Well, we do find out that is purely vibranium around his neck, because the heart-shaped herb that is in Wakanda also is a different, it's an undisclosed plant, but it's a plant that is inside of Talokan as well, or is the reason why Talokan is brought about in the beginning, because the vibranium that is necessarily in that plant is also in the heart-shaped herb that Bast gives to the Wakandans as well. We then move on into the courtroom for the Wakandans, and this is probably the best scene I've seen of M'Baku, which we get him as the comic relief here, and everyone's favorite line, "You bald-headed demon." By the way, if you don't know, that is actually an impromptu line which he was just literally feeding off of everybody in the room, and because of all of the grief that was going on and everybody was sad and somber, he used that moment to portray a bit of humor, and it shined through in the movies, that it shined through in the actual film, and they kept it, and it's actually gold. Fast forward again through the conversation between Queen Ramonda and Okoye inside of Shuri's lab, because of the fact that the encounter with Namor before, Queen Ramonda is very hesitant to let her daughter go anywhere outside of Wakanda in any search of some fish guy, or in this case fish man, as M'Baku likes to call him. Then she allows it to happen, and this is kind of a foreshadowing of a potential what might happen with Shuri, but slight plot twist when it actually happens, though. Cut to Alexandria, VA, which is the home base of the CIA, and also where we will find Agent Ross as well, which we then run up against none other than Val. After that, Ross mentions in the conversation with Queen Ramonda after he finds the Okoye beads, that he literally owes his life, or owes Wakanda in general, because they saved his life, or T'Challa and Shuri actually saved his life in general, or in a specific situation when Killmonger came through basically trying to rescue Claw, and in that same battle, Ross was hit with a bullet, and inside of that situation, T'Challa saved his life with an Okoye bead, stabilized him, brought him back to Wakanda, and Shuri further saved his life in her lab. Among the conversation with Agent Ross and Val, and then also in the conversation with Queen Ramonda, it's understood that the US now needs a new suit, and by suit that means a Iron Man suit, which is what Tony Stark would have been in the trade for if he was still in the arms deal, or if he was still alive. But in general, if he was still alive and still in the arms deals, that is exactly who the US would have gone to actually make the weapon that they were looking for. So we head to MIT, which is where we find Riri Williams, and on the campus of MIT, this is a funny moment between Okoye and Shuri, which is basically a nod to Fenty, which is a popular brand across pretty much every African American woman. And because of that, we then transition from that fun moment into a conversation, or the conversation that Shuri has with Okoye, saying that I can blend in a little bit faster than you would, and Okoye says I can blend in. We all know that is completely false. Shuri heads into the dorm room, or the dormitory, which is in the hallway. She knocks on the door of none other than Riri Williams, and when she opens the door, Riri is basically dumbfounded because she realizes who she is, which is now a fully identification that Wakanda is in the limelight and has been for a long time. The conversation between Shuri and Riri basically gives us a insight on the brilliance of Riri, which she discloses that she built the machine that was looking for vibranium in the ocean inside of a class project, which is basically like child's play for her. But what it triggered for me was the MIT licensing that is usually done on projects of this nature, mechanical engineering, software engineering, and that nature of profession. Most of the time, if there's an MIT license, there are probably loopholes that you can run through. In this case, the government, on the case of Riri Williams, they take her property, or the idea of her property, recreate it, and then use it inside of the government sphere of we're looking for evidence of vibranium. The conversation that is had between Shuri and Okoye specifically reminds me of the conversation between Iron Man, or Tony Stark, and Spider-Man Peter Parker inside of his apartment, or inside of May's apartment. As they're having this conversation, it also gives me a glimpse into the Chicago style roasting that, if you've never heard that before, it's basically what happens when Riri says,
"You need to be conscious of the way that you look. Walking around here with that ash on your head."
And that is exactly what Southside Chicagoans do specifically, or African American Chicagoans do a lot. And what it's called is roasting, if you've never heard of it before. She also makes mention, when fast forwarding into her own lab, or to her garage, she also makes mention of the quantum CPU that she has a 2056-bit encryption on, which is absolutely astonishing. And Shuri just jokingly asked, how many times you locked yourself out of that? Because it is very easy to do that. And Riri actually responds, I've done it a few times. In that same sphere of that scene, we also get a look at, or a glimpse of Koye, which is played by Denai Guerrera, who also featured on The Walking Dead. And in that, she basically gives us a look back to her character on The Walking Dead with her spear when she comes into contact with the feds. We get a cool callback to Riri's first flight as Ironheart in her jerry-rigged Ironheart suit, or Iron Man suit in this case, which she mentions that there's a full YouTube channel, which there is, based on everything that pertains to building an Iron Man suit, which she has vibranium to power that suit, which is what we see as the arc reactor in the middle of her suit, which is different from the arc reactor obviously inside of the original Iron Man suit, which is based off of the Tesseract. We now see the fight between the Talocans and Riri, Okoye, and Shuri, which is basically after the feds catch them in the garage. We see them on the bridge, which is the first time that we see the Talocans in person, up close and more up close and personal. And specifically, we see Atuma, which is again a rival of Namor and Namora. The language that they are speaking is a native language of the Mayans, which is where we are grabbing the native tongue for, or the mother tongue for, Talocans in this movie, which we later find out that Wakandans picked that up because of their technological advance. Because of this, we now have another conversation between Ramonda and Agent Ross, and in that conversation it is shown that the Talocans actually speak Mayan, or more specifically the Goyo mentions that the Talocans say or have a mother tongue of Mayans, and the only person that she knows that possibly could have that same skill set is Nakia, which is why we head to Haiti after that. There's a conversation that then is had between Ramonda and Nakia, and in that conversation we find out that Nakia did not attend T'Challa's funeral. She says that it was just too hard to do, but we understand later that it was because that she was protecting a certain somebody. But this also then leads me back to the theory that potentially Queen Ramonda could have been giving, or there was already a ceremony and she was already the wife of T'Challa, which is then why she was trying to give the heart-shaped herb to Nakia in Black Panther, the original Black Panther, which again, that should have gone to Shuri in any case. But because there was a possibility that she could have been queen, that was maybe why she went that way in the original movie. But in this scene, we see that kind of play out again in the exchange that they're having with each other, in the familiarity of the exchange. And then also, if you don't know, it plays into the Mayan history of this film, plays into the fact that Lupita has a Hispanic heritage. This is also the first time that we get a Queen Mother or Queen Mother reference, which comes from the comics, which is a beautiful reference for me. In the next scene, where we then, after we've seen the moving of Shuri and Riri after going up against the Talocans, we then pick up with them inside of Talocon, where Riri basically believes that the stuff that is being given to them is completely poisonous or what have you, and she references the white chick from Indiana Jones. When the attack happens by Nakia, we hear the same song that is sung by the Telecons when they are attacking the ship. And in the earlier conversation between Shuri and Namor, Namor mentions, when you age as I do, and Shuri reconfirms that yes, he is a very old character, or she asks, have you been alive this long? Or have you been alive this long? Basically giving a nod to the fact that Namor is the very first, or one of the very first characters inside of the Marvel lore. As Nakia rescues Shuri, she then tells Shuri to move her left arm, which to me, that seems like a nod to the MCU gag of shooting or taking off someone's arm, which in this case, she does not take off Shuri's arm because she's trying to save her, but she tells her to move her left arm, which if she didn't, she would have actually shot her arm off. When she does that, she does hit the telecon that is behind her, and when she's rescuing her, Riri tells her that, hey, we should go with her, or whoever this lady is, because she doesn't know who Nakia is. But we can hear that Shuri says, if we do this, this will mean war, because she remembers the conversation that she just had with Namor, that Namor is trying to go at the surface world because of the fact that when he returned back to his own homeland with his mother's remains, he found basically slaves, or the people that came, or the descendants of his people were being enslaved, and he literally flipped tables and got his name from a rabbi, I believe, that was inside of that Spanish house. From there, basically the child without love, and that is where he gathers his name from in this movie, which is a direct parallel to the fact that Namor's actual name inside of the comics, or his Atlantean name, is Avenging Sun. Shuri is then returned to Queen Ramonda, and things seem to go back to normal, the way that she envisioned later on in the movie, the way that they should be. But we then see that the war that the impending war that she was talking about actually does come to pass, because in the conversation between Okoye and Nakia, when actually Nakia sees Okoye for the first time and she calls her sister, when they have their conversation about T'Challa and why she was not there after the whole thing with Thanos and where she disappeared to and all that kind of stuff, because if you don't know, inside of the Infinity War Endgame saga, she then disappeared. After the blip, she was nowhere to be found. But in that conversation, in the background, you can see that there's water that starts to seep in on the ground. This is the foreshadowing, or the starting point of Namor waging war on Wakanda, which is exactly what he does inside of the comics a bunch of different times. We then see the same sonic attack that happened earlier in the film, where the Telecons actually try to bring all of the Wakandans off of their ship, or off of their base, or what have you. The same thing can be said in the way that whales do the same to their prey, which is basically take everything away, or sonically hit them with blows and then stun them, making them basically impenetrable to any attack, making them vulnerable, I should say, to any attack that comes after that. Gorilla sighting of M'Baku, which is the characterization, or the comic accurate characterization of M'Baku. Inside the comics, he is actually known as the White Gorilla. Here, a nod to the mention of Namor, or the powers of Namor, citing that he's faster in water, just as fast in air, but if you place him inside of water, he's way faster. This is coming when they are trying to hit him inside of the Quinjet and basically can't, because he's way too fast inside of water. We then understand later on in a future conversation between Riri and Shuri that diffusion is the only way to take his powers away from him, which is because everything that he gets from water seeps into his skin, and he becomes stronger even outside of water as long as he has water on him. We then are hit with a tragic moment with Queen Ramonda trying to save Riri, but in that same token failing to save herself. And we then see the crack of Shuri when she finally understands that all of the people that were close to her, her father, her brother, and now her mother, are now gone. And she says the only person, when she talks to M'Baku, she says the only person that truly knew me is gone, and I just buried her, and all of whatever you just asked me, all of that pride is now buried with her. This is basically the turning point for me, where Shuri now becomes Black Panther in the mindset that she's going to need going forward to actually defeat or battle with Namor. Have a quick back and forth between M'Baku and Shuri, which is basically a callback to the original Black Panther, where she says a child that scoffs at tradition, which is basically the callback of M'Baku saying all of your technological advances have been led by a child who scoffs at every tradition that we have, which is again a callback to the fact that Shuri does not believe that the ancestral plane is a real thing that Namor then has now given her. She has the idea to, one, use the fibers of the bracelet in search of a synthetic way to create the heart-shaped herb, and also has a conversation with Riri to understand that fighting Namor in water or fighting him in air, as long as he has water on him, is completely futile. But if you take him away from water and take the water away from his body, he is completely useless or powerless at that point. And if we can do that, there's a process known as diffusion, and that is the light bulb moment that both of them have standing in front of her workstation. As we get the montage of Shuri finding the percentile that is actually going to work, we find that she is closer and closer to a potential cure or the actual working of the heart-shaped herb. And that happens when it glows, and we see that happening with Nakia inside the lab, basically asking what is going to happen, how do we know this is going to actually work. In that same montage, we get a callback to Iron Man 1, or the original Iron Man, when Riri is hammering out her Ironheart suit and hammers out the framework of a heart inside of iron, which is exactly the same thing that Tony Stark did for his pattern for the arc reactor back in Iron Man 1. When Shuri actually successfully creates the heart-shaped herb synthetically again, Nakia says that this is the greatest gift since Bashanga's discovery, which is a callback to the original Black Panther, which is where Bast actually came into play, giving him the heart-shaped herb in the first place. They then recreate the tribal ancestral plane. I don't know exactly what that's called, but inside of that, she then makes a callback to, or inside of that conversation, when Shuri is getting the heart-shaped herb, Nakia says, "Are you sure you don't want me to bury you?" And that basically is a callback to the original Black Panther, where T'Challa and Killmonger are all buried when they receive the heart-shaped herb, which potentially is the reason why she then says, "No, I need you to have access to my chest, because if I have cardiac arrest, you need to have access to that." And she then puts the Okoye beads on top of her chest. When she reaches the ancestral plane, she is then wearing white and comes through the same place that her mother died earlier, which is basically through water inside of the palace or inside the throne room. I theorized about this on my Instagram, but I thought that there was a potential way that Killmonger could be in this movie, and in fact he is. And if you were investigating like I was around Google, you would have actually seen that Michael B. Jordan is actually a part of the cast, which he wasn't a part of the cast before, or he wasn't listed as a part of the cast before. And just as a note, Killmonger also has on white, similar to all of the other ancestral plane figures that we've seen before, including T'Challa and T'Chaka, his father included. They all have on white, which is the way that mourning happens inside of Wakanda. It's not necessarily just a cultural thing, in a black cultural thing at this point. It's the way that Wakandans actually do this in terms of grief. In the Jaka, or Killmonger actually then says to inside of the conversation that he is then having with Shuri, that how is never as important as why, which is a callback to the conversation that Shuri and Queen Mother were having inside of the bush, basically saying that she wants to burn the world, which is exactly the same thing that that Namor hears her say as well. The two basically seem like a parallel, which are that Shuri has always never really aligned herself with the way that things are handled inside of Wakanda, in terms of the way that her father did and the way that her brother reigned. And she's always felt like there's a way to do this differently. And we get that same feel from the way that she's portrayed inside the comics as well, specifically speaking here with Doom War. The way that she's portrayed inside of Doom War is exactly the way that she feels inside this movie. Very in your face and cutthroat, without any regard for human life unless it's Wakandan. Killmonger also mentions in that conversation that her father, her brother were never really able to do the things that they needed to do. Specifically, T'Challa was never able to. He was more diplomatic in the way that he did things, and he actually let the man that killed his father live instead of, in this case, killing him, or what Killmonger would have actually done. In the background, you can also hear the Quinjet grabbing Queen Mother or Queen Ramonda and bringing her up to the ancestral plane. You can hear that in the background of the conversation, if you listen closely, of the conversation between M'Baku and Shuri. Shuri then returns from the ancestral plane, but she believes that it didn't actually work, because when Nakia actually asks her, who did you see, what happened, what's going on, Shuri doesn't say anything, or more specifically dodges the question and says, they abandoned me, they didn't come, they weren't there. But in that conversation with Killmonger, we also have a look inside of why she actually took the heart-shaped herb in the first place. Again, going back to the fact that she doesn't look at any of the traditions as valuable. The reason why she takes this heart-shaped herb is because she wants vengeance upon Namor and nothing else. That's the same reason why Killmonger even comes to Wakanda. He wants vengeance basically upon Wakanda at that point, because everything that he's seen up until this point as a adult has been hardship, and it didn't have to be that way if Wakanda would have stepped in. Now, looking at Shuri in this light, she's saying, everyone abandoned me, there was no one there, but the reason why she took the heart-shaped herb was because of vengeance, and the main person that she needed to see was Killmonger, and that is still an ancestor of hers as well. So we then see that Shuri does actually have the Black Panther powers, because when she smashes a suit that is originally given to the Dora Milaje, it literally catapults across the room and goes flying, shattering, possibly even down through the lab of Shuri. We then understand that she is now fully the Black Panther, which is also, if you also then pay attention to the rest of the movie, this is the only thing that Griot calls her, which before she gets the Black Panther powers, he always calls her Princess Shuri. After she gets her powers, he never calls her that again. He always refers to her as Panther. When she then reveals herself to the village of Wakanda, the village that is now completely held up in Jabari land at this point, when she reveals herself to the Wakandans, there's a exchange that then happens between M'Baku and Shuri. The testing that he is doing with her is not necessarily to shame her, it's to find out if she in fact is the Black Panther, and if she is, she would have way more strength than he does. When she passes this test, she then announces herself as the Black Panther, and M'Baku and Shuri then have a private conversation that ends with M'Baku telling Shuri that if we go at Namor, this could be eternal war, because of the fact that they look at Namor, or the Talokans look at Namor as a god, or the serpent god, which is basically where he gets his name of, Kukulkan. They look at him as a serpent god. So if we go at him right now, or at any point, and we kill him, they are always going to come back at us, which is exactly the same through point or plumb line that you will see with Namor and Black Panther or T'Challa in the comics. They go at each other a lot, and I do mean a lot. Forward into the ship scene where Wakandans, or the Wakandans, have basically drawn Namor and the Talokans out of their hiding place, and in that same space they trick them to coming to the surface. When they bring them to the surface, they then start the battle, which is basically taking their sonic abilities away, so they can't summon any whales or anything like that, or any fish, any sea creatures. And inside of that same situation, we then get a very cool shot once Namora realizes that the underbelly of the ship has a sonic drum that can be blown up. If she blows that thing up, then that fares the fight for the Talokans in their case. So when she does that, we get a very cool shot of a contrast between the explosion and the rise between the surface of the water. And this is probably one of the more cinematic shots that we get inside of this area of the movie, which basically is all action at this point. And from this point, it is completely up. It calls back to an older Black Panther design, and inside of this fight, we see that Namor is now being diffused, and all of the water is basically being taken away from his body. And we also hear the initialization of the Midnight Angels when Okoye and when Shuri activates them for the very first time, basically telling Shuri, or basically telling Okoye onwards, or in basically telling Shuri basically telling Okoye onwards in Wakanda. With Namor then goes completely ballistic, and we get the beach scene from the trailer that we were all clamoring all over about on who was in that Black Panther suit, which we then see Namor hit his famous line from the comics, which we then hear. Namor then says his famous line from the comics, Imperious Rex. Shuri then says the title of the movie, Wakanda Forever. Shuri then says Wakanda Forever, which causes the jet to blow up and hit Namor, which again, because of his diffusion, is now basically has now put him in a weakened state. Inside of that, we then see a very powerful moment between Namor and Shuri, which is where Shuri asks him to yield, which is again a callback to when T'Challa asked M'Baku to yield, or basically yield so that his people can still thrive, which is exactly what Shuri says that she's trying to have happen here as well, which is saying that rage and revenge have taken over their entire beings and consumed them, but they can change what happens with this situation, and they can become allies if he yields. He then decides to, and they basically join forces, and again a wonderful moment at the end of the movie happens between Wakanda and the Talokan, bringing both sides together, which possibly could set things up for a future MCU situation. Generally, maybe in terms of Secret Wars, maybe we might need Namor on our side to actually go up against Kang. So possibly this may be a setup for a call to Namor later on in the MCU. We then return back to Wakanda and the iconic walk-up shot of Shuri, which is basically a callback to the walk-up shot in the beginning of Wakanda Forever, which is where T'Challa walks into Shuri's lab for the first time and then gives a handshake to Shuri, which is exactly what Shuri does to Riri. Inside of that, we have a nice exchange between Shuri and Riri, which is where Shuri decides to tell her that, hey, that Iron Heart suit that you built, it's wonderful, but I can't let you leave here with it because, you know, sanctions and all that kind of stuff. Riri understands and decides, hey, that's cool. But Shuri unveils that the car that was previously used in the car fight or the car chase between the feds and Okoye, Shuri, and Riri now has been rebuilt meticulously, and it is fully working and ready to go. Riri says that this was my dad's car, and that this was my Riri says that this was my dad's car, and he used to work on it before, and she stops. And what that makes me think of, could it be that he either died or he possibly got blipped and did not return? We finally get our final scene where the challenge is being given by M'Baku, of all people, and that's a callback again to the original Black Panther for the challenge of the throne. In this case, because of the fact that M'Baku is basically the guiding force for Shuri in the way that she became Black Panther, because in that conversation that they were having earlier, he tells her that life has taken way too much from you for you to still be looked at as a child. So this is kind of a parallel or a funny contrast to what would have actually happened in Wakanda in terms of a challenge, but now is a lighthearted way of saying, hey, this is fine. I want a challenge, but she's not actually, the Black Panther is actually not here. So I'm going to challenge for the Black Panthership. Actually, we know that he's not actually doing that, but it's a funny way of saying this is where we're going with this. And also there's a callback to Shuri in the same way that we had him. And also we get a callback to Shuri, which is the stand-in in place of him, in this case, was a predecessor, is Shifo, the shaman, which is standing next to M'Baku when he says that he wants to challenge. Similar to the original Black Panther, when the chant that happens from the entire Wakandan, when the chant happens from everyone in Wakanda, the name that you can hear is Shuri this time and not T'Challa, which in the original Black Panther you heard T'Challa instead of which instead you heard T'Challa, which now we hear Shuri. And we then get a very heartwarming moment between Nakia and Shuri, where Shuri is now heading to Haiti and is basically going to do the burning of her garments, which, going back to the earlier conversation between her and Ramonda, is a releasing of the grief that she's feeling, because again, Wakandans wear white to symbolize grief, which is a complete contrast to what people do in the United States and pretty much everywhere, which is wear black. Wakandans wear white, and then after that they burn the garments to then symbolize that we're letting go of everything that has happened in terms of the grief, and we're embracing it, but we are also embracing the memory of those ancestors as well. When she does burn this, we then get the ending moment, or a ending montage moment of Shuri standing and sitting with the memory of her brother, and a memory or a montage of T'Challa, which is basically the audience getting the same, which to me feels like a way that Ryan Coogler allowed the audience to feel the exact same emotion that Shuri should be feeling and is feeling on screen with her and through her at the same time. We then get a post-credit that is one for the ages, and we'll explain that all in more detail in a future video. But we then find out that Nakia and T'Challa had a son, and potentially they were married undisclosed. Again, the story isn't necessarily there for that to be expounded upon, but potentially we might have had, again, Nakia and T'Challa married off in the shadows somewhere, and that again is why Queen Ramonda brought the heart-shaped herb to her in the beginning. My question to you guys is, when do you think that Nakia was pregnant? And do you think that she was pregnant in the entirety of this the original Black Panther? When did it happen inside of Infinity War? What do you think? Leave that down in the comment section below. And if you like this video, please go ahead and hit that like button. And until next time, until next video, blur it out.